Do you want to go back to normal after Corona? Do you really want to go back to normal? I don't. Welcome to the podcast, Not Back to Normal. I am Markus Druen, and I want COVID-19 to change the business world for the better. In each episode, I talk to entrepreneurs, business leaders, and change makers about how they have adapted in this crisis and how they further intend to change the way they live, work, and run their businesses for the better, to make capitalism much more conscious and working for all. Today, I'm speaking with Katharina Moser. Katharina is a socio-political entrepreneur based in Vienna. She most recently co-founded the Creative Corona Corporation to help teams to communicate and collaborate well during this time of isolation. She also runs MOSAIK, an agency that designs and facilitates events where citizens can experience firsthand what it actually means to be European. We talk about how she has adapted since the lockdown, both on a personal level and as an entrepreneur. We then dive into the topic of making online encounters, whether that's conferences, social gatherings, or meetings, as human as possible. It was my first podcast experiment, and I hope you enjoy Katharina's positive and vibrant energy as much as I did. Katharina, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
How do you describe what it is you do? What do you do for a living?
Well, I like to call myself a socio-political entrepreneur. So basically, what I do and what I've been doing for the past 5 years is to create meaningful gatherings that kind of give us a feeling of belonging. So basically, that means I design events and formats very much around the topics of, for instance, Europeanness. So in the past years, I've designed products like a card game on European fun facts, but also major events where I brought together 800 people in the city of Vienna who could discover different European countries in the middle of their own city.
Wow, and how did you get into that line of work?
I always like to tell the story of when I was 18. I grew up in a rather conservative city in Austria, in Salzburg, and at the age of 18, I needed to get out, so I moved to Spain for a year and I did a European voluntary service there. And I lived in a flat with 8 people from 6 different European countries, and it was this typical Auberge Espagnole thing. And I think that was the moment that kind of triggered my interest in intercultural diversity and just learning from each other about different cultures and about different languages. For me, that was a very enriching experience, but also one that gave me this feeling of Europeanness. And I think from then on, I just wanted to figure out how I could also pass that on to others.
Fascinating. And so let me just play this back to you. You are in event creation that very much relies on people being there in person, face to face. That must massively disrupt your business, right?
Yes, it did. But then again, I was like kind of preparing for this podcast. I was looking back at the past 2 months, but also a bit on the time before. And in a way, I felt like this did come at the right time for me. Because in the past years, I've already kind of discovered for myself that I didn't necessarily just wanted to be an event manager. So even though my main kind of breadwinning job was to create events, like on my own initiative, create big events and invite people, but also for clients, design events for them or give them consulting on how to design events. I figured that this interruption really did something to my business by kind of shifting the focus of just, designing normal events to really looking at how can we create meaningful gatherings by focusing on that human element. And that has somehow come to the attention of people because we're only meeting online anymore.
Yeah, we'll get to that later on. I'd first like to understand how this whole thing impacted you. So take us back to the before Corona crisis days. Describe your old normal. Like, what did a typical day or typical week or even a typical month look like in your life?
I guess given that I'm kind of self-employed, but most of my days look different. I didn't have like a proper routine, but it definitely involved lots of meetings, having calls, meeting with people, having lunch meetings, and of course lots and lots of traveling. So I did go to a lot of conferences, gave workshops in different settings and events, traveled also in my free time. So that was definitely something that has changed.
When did you take the COVID-19 crisis serious? Like, what turns the media noise into a signal for you to take serious?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think we're all kind of following the news, and first it was very distant. It was just about China, and then it got closer and closer, and it was in Italy. But I remember I was actually at this event that I got invited to by an Austrian politician just a bit earlier. And it was, a private gathering, but the former chancellor was there, and also several ministers. And we were actually making jokes about if you could still shake hands. But, being surrounded by such high-ranking people who would actually be involved in a decision-making process, you'd kind of think, all right, we can still joke about that. So it's not that serious. And that was just 2 weeks before the lockdown happened. So I think the moment I did start to take it seriously was when I got a message by a friend who's also quite close to, people in the government. And he just said, you better go food shopping tomorrow.
Yeah, so take us back to when your country, Austria, actually went into lockdown. What happened? And especially in these first few days, what was the sense of what kind of liberties that we are grown accustomed to in our democracies, that they were out of a sudden not there anymore? Because effectively a lockdown is a bit like a nice house arrest, isn't it?
Yeah, you could call it that. And I think in the beginning it did also feel like that. But I mean, I think the first, I remember there was like this first press conference where they initially announced that there will be a lockdown, and that was a Friday, and the lockdown would start Sunday/Monday. And I remember, I think I just felt really excited because in a way, nothing similar like that has happened before. So I was just constantly on the phone with my friends and just talking about the implications that this would have, and going on a street and doing your food shoppings and toilet paper shoppings. It felt like everyone was in this shared experience, and we were all kind of looking at each other, and people were somehow more friendly on the streets because everyone's kind of, yeah, we're in this together. But also I remember one of the first things that I discussed with a close friend of mine was how interesting it was to observe this kind of mass dynamic that emerges very quickly of people being told, look, this is the new normal, this is the new rules, and then they just oblige and they obey and they just do what they've been told. And I also remember I posted a video on Facebook in I think it was the first week, and it showed me on the street filming, a police car that drove by playing music, which I found quite touching at the beginning. But I also got quite a bit of a shitstorm of people telling me, why did you even, leave your house? And I remember conversations I had with very close friends who asked me the same, like, why do you even go out? So it's an interesting dynamic that that kind of emerged at the beginning of people even starting to accuse each other for leaving the house. So that kind of made me very alert to also observe my own reaction to what we're being told and try to stay critical in a way.
I'd like to segue into how you adapt as an entrepreneur. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted you on the podcast, because I actually think we're not in the same boat. I think we're in the same storm. As you say, we all share that experience. Pandemic one, as Bill Gates calls it, is the first 21st century global experience where billions of people basically respond to the same thing. Yet we are in a flotilla with very, very different boats. Some people are on their yachts, some people are on their shipwrecks. And obviously what's striking is that with people like yourself, an entrepreneur, you almost instinctively think about, so what can we learn? How can we see this as an opportunity? So I'm really curious to hear how this forced lockdown has got your creative juices going? Because as an event organizer, manager, host, facilitator, I imagine your livelihood is pretty much taken away from you like a rug under your feet almost in an instant. So tell us about how you shift your business from the real world into an online world.
Yeah, I mean, it's true, in the first days or first weeks, you had obviously all your jobs cancelled, any moderation jobs, all the kind of event design that I was about to do, that was all gone. But then again, as you say, you kind of, as an entrepreneur, you immediately switch to solution finding mode. And I was happy enough to also have one colleague / friend who I'd been working with before. And I think that brought us really close together. So from the first day on, we were like constantly talking about ways on what we could do now, what could be needed now. And I mean, I love her. She's so funny because she always comes up with tons of ideas. Like first day, she's like, all right, now that students can't go to school or kids can't go to school, there will be lots of mothers who would need childcare. Should we do that? And I was like, do you like kids? And she's like, well, no, not necessarily. Do you? And I was like, well, I've never had contact with kids. I was like, well, maybe that's not the way to do it. But then we just kind of started brainstorming. And I think it was like on day 3 or something that we have developed a new project or a new website even. And we just called it Creative Corona Cooperation, because we basically put her and my expertise together. And she's coming from the field of innovation. She's doing tons of workshops each year. And me from this kind of more event design perspective, which is kind of looked at what we could offer. And the first thing that we did was basically just trying to pass on that mindset that you just described of being entrepreneurial and just finding solutions and also dealing with disruption and uncertainty. So we offered consulting to teams on how to continue working in a productive way and how to communicate and cooperate well, even though everyone was, sitting in their remote offices. And that actually worked quite well. So we have now also shifted it a bit further, but it was great to see that you can, if you want to, just find new ways very quickly.
So I'm quite curious to hear from you what you did first at the level of self, or rather in parallel, whilst you were shifting your business and coming up with this great, I love the name, Creative Corona Corporation. Wonderful.
I think you're touching on a very important point there, because I think most of us will have had those kind of different stages or phases of kind of reacting to Corona. And I think for me, it was at the beginning, really this excitement that I described and this kind of, okay, what can we do now? What's the next project? And immediately also finding clients and work with them and just feeling good about staying active. And then a bit later, so I'd say maybe 3rd or 4th week, I probably had that kind of low and that just losing my motivation and, feeling a bit depressed and all of that. And also, living on my own is not always that easy. So there are those feelings of loneliness and all of that kind of hits you. And then I think I had a turning point. That also kind of was related to a seminar that I did online. And what it did is basically what you describe as well, that kind of just giving you this allowance to pause for a second and step back and really look at what's important to you right now. And that to me was reconnecting with myself and connecting with my purpose. And that kind of just came later on. And ever since, I think I've been focusing so much more on myself and on that self-care and on kind of listening to those inner voices. Because otherwise, before we didn't have the time to do that. There was too much noise. We were always distracted, so we couldn't really listen to that. But now really it's been a huge chance to focus on that core within ourselves.
So how do you do that, Katharina?
So I think I mean, one of the things that we probably do have in common is this elaborate morning routine that we already kind of touched upon before. And I think I've really allowed myself to give myself time in the morning and dig deep into what I need. So shall I describe you the morning routine?
Yeah, sure.
Cool. So I do get up, and then basically first thing I do after just opening my window, and I'm not as fortunate as you, I don't live next to forest, I'm actually quite in the city center of Vienna, but it's good to just, let the air in and see what's happening outside, which these days isn't much. But then I just sit down and I have a little manifesto that I wrote for myself at the beginning of the lockdown. And it's basically just, positive affirmations. So I read through them and just give myself a bit of calm before also, of course, switching on my phone, which I still do in the morning. And then after having breakfast and just, giving myself a good cup of tea, I read. I have my morning kind of newsletters that I open up. And then I have my phone call with my Corona buddy, that girl that I mentioned that I work with these days, which is also very important, just having someone to connect with in the morning. And then I do a very long meditation session these days. I also did a meditation training in the past weeks that was very helpful in that regard. And after that, I think about half an hour of stretching exercises, and I always combine that with uplifting music and just songs that get me in a good mood. Take my shower, and then I also do a bit of journaling and planning my day. And that all in all takes up to 2.5 hours sometimes. I think I would have never done that before. I would have always felt too rushed to get out. But now I feel like, I need this to actually prepare me for my day.
And based on how you feel today and how you can project your life into the future, how much of that routine, that extended routine, do you think you're actually going to keep? And the reason why I'm asking is this podcast is called Not Back to Normal. And a good crisis usually triggers some profound changes. And then also because we're creatures of habit, we kind of like go back to the normal. And what's your sense of that? Are we going to see Katharina doing her 2.5 hour extended morning routine even next year when assumably life resumes somehow back to normal?
Yes, I hope so, actually. Please take me up on that. One thing that I really kind of noticed is that quite often we live in a very reactive mode. So we have, people calling us, people writing us emails, meetings coming up, blah, 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 and we just react to it. And I feel like the more you really take care of yourself and the more you really focus on your own routines, the more you allow yourself to get back into an active mode instead. So what I notice is that I start working at 10, like the earliest, and I just don't make meetings before 10 anymore. And I try to actually postpone most of the calls that I have to the late afternoon because I enjoy just, keeping that calm to myself in the morning and trying to work in a focused and concentrated way. So I try to not have those social interactions online before the afternoon. So I think it has already shifted something in the way how I plan my days and how I interact with others. And I do truly hope that I can continue to do that afterwards. I mean, I've already kind of canceled my my office that I had. I was working in a co-working space, and I've basically just moved to this remote office at home now, and I do quite enjoy it. So I'm not sure. I'm curious to see what's going to happen after the summer. And I mean, my flat's going to be boiling hot during the summer. But I truly hope that I will be able to take most of it into the new normal.
Yeah, so let's get on to the topic of online gatherings and online meetings. One of my clients, the CEO, he says, do you know what, Marcus? I love this new normal. I love being at home, seeing my kids. I don't want to commute into work anymore. And even when we can, I might be the first CEO in Germany who actually says, I stay at home. And if you want to see me, you know where I live, but I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to sit in a car in traffic in order to be in an open plan office, to either spend my time behind a computer screen or to be in endless meetings. Now, obviously the catch with you and your business is that is very much your livelihood. It's not necessarily meetings, but designing meaningful meaningful gatherings with a real human connection. So let's just talk about how this could work in an online world, because my strong assumption is that online gatherings and online meetings are here to stay. So I'd like to basically get back to the origin. So let's start with the nature of a conference or a gathering. Why do people do that? Why do people travel across a country or even across the world to meet other people, listen to speeches, listen to panel discussions? What is the sociological reason for doing that?
I think the big point is that most of conference or event organizers are not asking themselves exactly this question. Why are they even having this meeting? Why are they having this event, this conference? And I mean, out of I suppose, our shared experience, we will be able to tell tons of stories of events and conferences that we joined that were just plain boring, speakers who are not very engaging, frontal speeches, people glued to their phones because they can't pay attention. So I think quite often there wasn't really this big reason why people were having those conferences, other than, it's been there for ages, or I don't know, executives need an excuse in their annual report that they've done something, or speakers wanting to portray their egos. So I think that's actually one of the big chances that we're facing now, and also for what I'm doing, is that before I was probably, an event organizer, an event manager. But now, actually, the things that I consider really important, which are this human element, they're suddenly becoming much more important. Because if you just shift the way how events and conferences used to be from before to the digital world that we're living in now, people are just going to log off, or they're just going to shut down their videos. They're going to be on Netflix at the same time, and you won't even be able to notice. So we cannot just take it on from the life we had before to the online world, but we actually have to focus much more on those human elements, and also on why we're having those specific events. We really have to ask ourselves that question now.
And I think this is getting really to the heart of why I'm doing this podcast, because a lot of the practices, a lot of the habits, they're actually nuts. They don't really make a lot of sense. And to take these top 500 leadership conferences, of which I've attended a few and also facilitated some, I remember one. I mean, this was kind of like the epitome of ridiculousness, really. It was 500 people in an audience. The lights were dimmed down to the point where you could actually nod off. And guess what? People did do that. And so I just find this really insulting to the speaker that that basically people are nodding off. But the whole experience, the whole conference is designed for this to happen, actually. And as a systems thinker, there is no such thing as a broken system. A system is always perfectly adapted to the needs and the wants of the people that really are in charge of that. So before we get into this shift towards online gatherings, why are conferences the way they are? They clearly serve some sort of purpose. And you already mentioned one. They serve the egos of perhaps the CEO who can do a keynote speak. But it seems to me really bizarre that we spend all this time and resources and money to do something that we all agree the majority of these events are okay at best and boring at worst. So why do we do that?
I think the idea why we do it is probably because we want to learn, and because we want to get to know people. Because, every conference has a program. It's about a specific topic. You will have experts and speakers and panels and everything. So I think the initial idea is to convey that knowledge. The thing is just that so often they completely forget how people learn, or they just don't pay attention to the human psyche, because our attention span in the last years has like dramatically decreased. And if conference organizers are not reacting to that, then, you know, we're just going to sit there and we're like physically not able to listen anymore, but they don't really care. And that other element of kind of bringing people together, I think that's such a core need that we have, and that we're becoming more and more aware of course, these days, since we can't do that anymore. So I think it does also try to serve that need of people just getting together, of us being social beings. But again, they're not really thinking it through till the end, because if my only interaction at a conference is actually, you know, having small talk to someone during the coffee break, that doesn't mean that it really creates any kind of meaningful encounter or interaction. So I think if actually we would start paying more attention to those initial ideas that we have about those gatherings, then they would be much more fruitful and much more kind of have better outcomes as well. And that's the thing, because if we do it online now, you kind of have to ask yourself, do I even have a why for this event? Or could this just be, I don't know, a newsletter? Or could it be a video that I put on YouTube and then people could actually watch it on demand whilst they're cooking? We really have to think about, why should this even be a live gathering where people get together? And if we do have a reason for that, then we can design it much better and create much better outcomes.
So let's take this specific example of you are in a conference in a big auditorium, and then it's the coffee break, and then you go outside. And then in my experience, and I'm an extrovert and I'm fairly confident in my own skin, and even I find this quite daunting. You have to sort of like gazing around. It's a bit like a lion in the savannah. Who looks interesting? Who do I want to talk to? Who perhaps do I not want to be approached by? And these are perhaps even very subconsciously running scripts in our head, because maybe I'm a short man and this is a tall man. There is just this weirdness around approaching people almost in slow motion to then have a small talk in quite fast chit-chatty type sort of like fashion. And if you now transfer this specific feature of a conference into the online world, where everything happens on Zoom, everything happens on this surface called the computer screen or your phone screen, where the keynote speaker is on the screen as much as the person you are then going to have quote unquote coffee with. So since you have elaborated the human element quite strongly, how would you now design this from scratch?
I mean, I think there is those two sides to it, of course. We're all kind of familiar with the term Zoom fatigue these days, because we've all experienced it over the past weeks, that, you know, you're just completely drained after spending hours and hours on Zoom calls. And it's for the reasons that you're describing, because our brains are just not used to that type of interaction. You know, when we have the Zoom call and 25 videos in front of us, we're constantly trying to look for those non-verbal communication signals, and our brain is just completely like, oh my God, you know, what's happening? I don't understand. So there is this difficult element to it, and this kind of lack of emotional exchange that we have much easier when we're meeting in real life. Actually, I think we're all familiar. Have you seen this brilliant video that was actually already released a few years ago? A conference call in real life. Did you see that?
Yeah, I
love it.
Hilarious.
It's so typical. We're all having this experience. So, you know, there are those downsides. But then I think, on the other hand, if we kind of use those tricks that the digital realm opens up, we can also very much use it in our benefit. And I think when it comes to designing, there are quite a few steps that you can take into consideration. I mean, you're kind of mentioning, I think it very much comes to the power of the host. So for instance, you mentioned that, you know, hierarchies might diminish in a way. There is this idea that the role of a host is to connect, equalize, and protect. Which, by the way, comes from Priya Parker, who's a great author and event designer in America. She's doing a brilliant podcast these days. It's called Together Apart, together with the New York Times. So check it out. She's great. So one of the things that she says is, that it's really the host's role to connect people, to equalize them, so bring them on the same kind of level for that specific duration of the event, and also protect them. So protect them from, you know, boredom, and protect them from disturbances from each other. So I think if we look at what, let's say with Zoom, what it offers, I think it's just about playing a bit more with the advantages that it has. Well, like you said, I mean, the hierarchies aren't there because everyone is on the same level on the screen, and that's a great way to get people interact easier, put them in breakout sessions and just make them network on the same level. Or actually, I mean, the inhibition threshold might be much lower in the way that we meet in digital meetings. I mean, that was also how we got in contact. You know, you see people in a meeting, you see their names immediately. You might just check them out straight away on LinkedIn. You see who they are. You can straight away get in contact with them. So I think there's quite a lot of things that you can play with. Also, when it comes to those human elements. I think the big question is if we dare to allow that kind of human element to be part of those meetings. And that very much comes back to the role of the host. Because in a way, a meeting already starts before people get online. You know, it already starts when people hear about it for the first time. So already by sending out the first invitation, you're setting the tone for the event, and you're also creating the first rules. So one of the things that you could do, for instance, is make people aware that, you know, their videos will be on and their backgrounds will be visible. So you can invite them to design their backgrounds according to the purpose of the meeting, and really invite them to bring in something, to play a bit with what people will be able to see in their background. What I also liked in a few events that I was part of was that they gave this moment at the beginning and also at the end, I think, where you were just allowed to actually look at each other's videos, which I think is a good thing to do, because I mean, we kind of scroll through those Zoom videos anyway, just kind of curious to see, okay, who's got their video on, who doesn't. But I like it to just give that moment to consciously do that. Because then you see people really sitting in front of their screens and kind of looking at all the different videos as if they were looking at each other's eyes, which of course is a bit difficult. But it's just a good moment to be aware, okay, there are different people. I kind of have to familiarize myself with them. I have to see how they look and what they do and what their backgrounds are and all of this. Because in normal settings, you know, we would have that moment of entering an event location, you know, probably putting our coat somewhere, having a coffee, just having a look around, but we don't have that. So I think we need to create that moment of arrival very consciously as well, because otherwise, you know, people just click on the link and then they're there and it starts. And they might still be somewhere completely else, you know, they might still be with their emails or their phone or their dog or their kids or anything. So I think it's important to consciously give people the time to really enter and to create a feeling of atmosphere that we are here together for this specific time to you know, do something together and be aware that we're here.
Yeah, and building onto that, what are the native opportunities that come with a technology like video conferencing? And let me just explain what I mean by native opportunity. I'm not quite sure this is the term. So when cinema arrived, it was different from what was there before. And then when TV arrived, there were all of a sudden native formats possible. But what most people did, in fact, was they just transferred what they knew from cinema onto TV. And then later on, we got this whole Netflix technology. And again, people just tried to copy and paste the 90-minute movie format that we knew from the cinema that was transferred into the TV and now transferred into this online realm. And then you get Netflix that basically has invented the seemingly eternal series where it's more like bite-sized, but actually the narrative is spread across a much, much longer airtime. So I hope I'm making myself clear. And now thinking about the shift between a real world conference or real world meeting into an online encounter, what do you think are these unique native opportunities that just come with that technology that were not really possible or easy to do before?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are the obvious ones, like we're saving time, We don't have to travel to any venues. We don't have that period of, coffee breaks. We don't need time to allocate people to different breakout rooms. Everything is very condensed, and that's an advantage. And it also has to be used in a way that online events have to be much shorter. They cannot be extended to 3 days of conference, but it has to be short and precise, 1 max 2 hour sessions, and then we need breaks. So I think that's definitely an advantage, that in a way we're saving time and also just really condensing the content to what's really important. Another one is, of course, that we're all independent from any venues. So I think one thing that I quite like is that occasionally when I'm joining a seminar where I don't need to show my video, I just, take my phone and I log in, and then I just walk outside, and I just go for a walk. And that's something, that wouldn't have been possible. So I think we can really play with that possibility to just, be in our own surrounding and use that in our advantage. Or another thing that I really like about online gatherings is the possibility to interact and give feedback in real time. It's like, for instance, you can use this program Miro, which is an amazing tool. I love it. It's basically just like one gigantic whiteboard that everyone can use at the same time to put post-its on it, to write little notes, to do brainstorms together. And how, like before, when we went to conferences or workshops, we would probably get those horrible reports with lots of pictures of flip charts with post-its on it that no one could ever read anymore. But now you actually create something that's usable afterwards in real time, all together, and you can immediately do it as part of the workshops.
I'd like to stitch together a few things you said earlier. Actually, at the beginning, you mentioned the Zoom fatigue, and then also you alluded to the fact that there are some new opportunities with regards to format, different types of interactions, and so forth, and then ultimately our ever-shortening attention span. So one of the things that really strikes me is I've got an almost 11-year-old boy, and I recently got dragged into the world of TikTok, which seems to be almost like towards the singularity of short attention spanning. But I do enjoy it. And a question that I have been pondering on for a long time is, why is it that we love, as consumers, we love TED Talks, late night talk shows, podcasts, YouTube, Instagram, what have you. And then when it comes to business or, conducting professional gatherings, they're basically boring as hell. So with your professional expertise and obviously having a hand in this pie, how do you explain that massive mismatch?
I think it's such a brilliant question that you're asking there. And what kind of pops up in my mind is one of my favorite quotes by a British writer who says, if you put two things together that have never been put together before, the world has changed. And I quite like this quote because it refers to putting together different worlds that would have so much potential if you combine them. Because if we look at this kind of, boring conference meeting, blah, blah world that actually holds a lot of important content, but in a way, it's just, it doesn't get across because people are just bored. And then you look at this other world that you just described of, TikTok and Instagram stories and YouTube and you name it. Quite often the content isn't that important or isn't that necessary, but the method is brilliant because it works with our short attention span. So I think it would be great to combine those worlds much more. And I think this is also something that will happen now naturally, because, well, otherwise people will just log off their meetings and they will be bored. So it's not going to work like this. But if you use the elements like good storytelling or short storytelling, bit of playfulness, authentic stories, and you use them in your online meetings, then I think you can tremendously increase the quality of those meetings. I mean, same with podcasts. I mean, this is just a conversation that two people are having, but you can listen to it whilst you're cooking your dinner, and it's actually quite engaging. Whereas at a conference where someone is just having a frontal speech for an hour, you won't be able to listen to it. So I think there is so much potential to use those formats that we find online, that we find entertaining, and just add them to our meetings and add them to our events. And then they will just get much more entertaining. And this is what we need to follow content.
It just instantly brings to mind an opportunity that I think a lot of my clients would really benefit from. So when I consult and coach executives, and it could be anything from strategy to innovation or merging with another company, there's a very typical pattern, and it has a lot to do with the egos of the people involved. And when I say egos, I'm not saying this in a derogatory or judgmental way. It's just the way we are. And any executive that I've ever met has an ego, and they have a certain sense for status and so forth. And so one of the really, really peculiar practices is to not be at a meeting when something important is being discussed or even being decided, and then afterwards saying like, oh, sorry, I wasn't on board. Can you just, and in German, there's just a wonderful phrase that, of course, it's like, ist nicht mit mir abgestimmt. So you haven't really gone the round towards me. And it has this very much like consumerist mindset, like you have to come to me and ask me if I'm happy to say yes to this proposal. And so what just instantly comes to mind is, what if we just recorded conversations, and not just these big meetings, but even like so Ray Dalio, the famous hedge fund manager and author of the book Principles, he basically records every single meeting. And this may have sounded absolutely impossible for most companies and their cultures, but listening to what you're saying, this would make total sense. If 2 or 3 people are talking about a really important decision and the 4th people can't come for whatever reason, you record it, and then you even pinpoint them if you are, really want to be of service. Say, look, between minute 10 and 15, this is what we're going to discuss, where you have a stake in it. Listen to it, and then afterwards tell us if you have a veto or not. This would dramatically improve decision-making time.
I think it's already happening. I heard that from a colleague of mine who told me that they're actually recording all their meetings, and they have a database where everyone can go and just access them. Which in a way, I think it sounds really scary, because it would make people very self-conscious about every single comment they make during a meeting. But then again, I mean, just like you described, it's genius. If you just want to, you have this argument with a colleague and you're like, yeah, but you said that in the last meeting, and he'd go, no, I didn't. And I was like, well, let's check. So of course, I think there's another advantage that we just have to get used to.
So I'd like us to go a little bit deeper and talk about what we all experience at the moment. And you beautifully explained that at the beginning. You actually feel more connected than ever, and yet you haven't seen many people, you haven't got physical touch. So what's actually going on right now in terms of our collective experience? How do you make sense of that connectivity that we all experience, that is happening by and large, either with a few exceptions in your neighborhood, you can still talk to somebody over the fence, but by and large is with a pixelated version of other people. Yet I absolutely share this, and I've talked to a lot of people who share this as well. There is just that sense of a global connection and even a global awakening. And maybe also we should mention that we saw each other the second time on Gaia, which is Otto Scharmer's initiative from the Presencing Institute to create a global awakening. So what can we learn from the crisis, and how can we actually really, really respond and re-emerge as a better species from all of that. So since you are a socio-political entrepreneur, let's just focus on the socio-political expert in yourself. What does this whole phase, as you say, tell you where we are at and what's happening to us? How do you make sense of it?
Such a good and such a big question. And I think those gatherings like Gaia that you just mentioned, or also the House of Beautiful Business, which I think was the other one where we met, are such great examples for me for the moments where I really do feel this shared humanity. And like I said, I think this is unprecedented. I mean, never before were there any events where everyone around the globe was affected. I mean, we kind of remember stuff like, 9/11 or the refugee crisis, where everyone was somehow kind of aware that this is happening, but we were never in exactly the same situation, more or less, kind of all having to endure similar emotions and being on lockdown, being at home. So I think what that kind of boils down to is that we all have to find ways to react on a very individual, but also on a collective level. And again, it starts with the individual, and it starts with, what are my emotions there, and becoming aware of that. What are my thoughts? What are my reactions? How do I feel? How do I behave? And yes, I mean, you said that at the beginning, that, we're not in the same boat, but we are in the same storm. So of course it's true that not all of us, are in the same situation. And in a way, I've come to believe that I'm actually quite privileged to live on my own and not have any toddlers running around who need my constant attention. So I do feel that, I'm maybe a bit more privileged in the way that I can focus more on myself and on how I feel at the moment. But there's this great quote by Viktor Frankl that says, when you're not longer able to change the situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. And I think this is this essential task that we all share right now, is to really look at ourselves. And it can start with very small things, just kind of create small rituals, create small habits, or small routines, like the morning routines that we described earlier, that you just make a non-negotiable for yourself. This is really the time when you do concentrate on yourself and you listen to what is there, because in the end, it's just about becoming more conscious to what's happening in the world right now, and in the second step, try to make sense of it together, and just in the third step, then react and go back into action. And there is just a quick one that comes to mind. I mentioned that I did a meditation course last week that also tremendously helped me to find that kind of connection to myself again. And one thing that guy said, and he's a brilliant teacher, he's Indian, he sits in Los Angeles, and he said, responsibility is the ability to respond. And I very much like that, because it boils down to the fact that we do really have to take care of ourselves before we can take care of the world and everything that's happening around us at the moment. It's really just about, okay, make sure that I take care of my ability to respond.
What do you make sense of this complete freedom of choice, almost like infinite possibility to connect with people? What's your thought process in this? What are your principles? How do you decide to use your precious time once you've done your morning routine to talk to whom and why?
It's an interesting one, because I feel like this question on who I need to feel social was one that was very important to me over the past weeks as well. Because I mean, I'm a bit of an extrovert. I'm a social person. I like to be amongst people. And before this all happened, I was very often having this feeling of nervousness in the morning, when you feel like, it's already 9 o'clock, I have to go outside, life is already happening out there, people are out there, my office is already open, everyone's working, I need to get out. And now sitting at home every day by myself, I felt like I really needed to ask myself the question, where does this nervousness come from? And is it really just my need to be social, or what is it actually that I'm longing for? So I actually sat with it for a while and then tried to dig a bit deeper. And I realized that by just going outside or going into a co-working space or meeting some random people on the street, that was more of a distraction and kind of giving myself the feeling of, oh yes, I'm social, there are people, I'm being loved, but it wasn't necessarily what I needed. So I think it's really important, the question that you're asking, because again, now we're becoming more conscious of who do we actually want to be social with, and who do we actually want to spend our time with. And I feel like a lot of people might have gone through a similar process of, at the beginning, in the first weeks, like having tons of Zoom calls with everyone and checking in with all your relatives or whosoever, and kind of connecting with people that they hadn't connected with in a while. But then at a specific moment, kind of boiling it down to your kind of core circles. So I feel that, to me, what's happened is two things. On one hand, there is, of course, still this kind of proximity bias, in a way, that I am close to people who are just living in my neighborhood because they are the ones that I can actually see, And I did start going on social distance walks already, quite early on, because otherwise I think I would have just gone nuts. And at some point, I think it was in week 4 or something, one of the friends that I met, actually, we did a rule break there, and she gave me a hug, and seriously, I burst into tears. So, you still need that kind of physical proximity, of course. And I did get a bit closer to the people who are living close enough to, let's just say, let's go for a walk. But then the other thing that happened is what I described before, that being international is just so much easier these days. And I actually have a new ritual as well on Sunday nights, that I meet up with a group of people that I met at a conference in December. And 2 of them are sitting in America, one is in Toronto, one girl's in Poland, 2 in Berlin, and me in Vienna. And we've really made it a habit to just have a like 1 or 2 hour chat Sunday evenings for me, and for some of them it's like Sunday afternoon in Chicago. So these are the kind of 2 things that are happening at the same time. This probably this concept of globalization, kind of thinking global, but still staying local.
So the lockdown is lifting, and the voices in people's heads are getting stronger. I want to go back to normal. I want my life back. And the reason why I have you on the podcast is you have at least a different voice in your head that says, no, let's not go back to normal, because the normal wasn't maybe really that great. And even though it may have been great for you and me, if I look at the world, the way capitalism runs, the way consumerist capitalism runs, neoliberal capitalism, these are just scripts, like a software, that really, really dictate our lives. And I definitely scratched my head when you described your previous life as a bit of a conference tourist. So assuming that you can actually go back to your previous lifestyle, to what degree do you really want to do that? Where are you right now on the 13th of May 2020 in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I quite like being a conference tourist. It was a bit of a joke between me and a friend, because we constantly met at different events all over the place. But I do truly believe that we, or at least I have become more conscious about being more sustainable in my lifestyle as well. So, I mean, it kind of starts with just checking where those strawberries actually come from in a supermarket, but obviously making more conscious choices about where to go, by the time when we can actually travel again. I think I will definitely try to also go more by train if possible, and probably reconsider going to faraway destinations. But also believe that, I mean, of course it's about our conscious choices, but it's probably also that the world's going to change anyway. And there will be less conferences. Maybe plane ticket will be more expensive again and all of that. But I think it's probably, I mean, one of the big hopes that we all have is that this will really bring change in people's behavior and in the way how we're dealing with sustainability. I mean, another thing that I had, you know, given that we spent so much time at home, I also had my Marie Kondo moment and did a bit of decluttering here. And you know, that's also something that I want to continue doing, is not consuming as much. I mean, just saw a documentary on fast fashion, and that's seriously troubling. I mean, I just learned that Zalando actually dumps all the clothes that you send back. I wasn't aware of that, you know. So I've always been a fan of clothes swaps, for instance, as a good alternative to just buying new stuff. And I think that's another thing, that it's just a small thing that you can do in order to just have a bit of a more sustainable lifestyle.
Yeah, you could try that in your 800 resident house that you live in.
Yeah, exactly. I actually wanted to do that at the very beginning, but then I thought maybe I do have germs on my clothes, so I better not exchange them with my neighbors.
And what product, or let's say consumer service, do you actually not miss, that now 2 months into the lockdown you realize actually I can do without it? So what would you not buy even though you can in future?
Well, I mean, what I say, I think is probably a lot about kind of the things that I bought before, is fashion and kind of products that I don't necessarily need. I think another thing I just discussed with a friend the other day is we have our restaurants opening on Friday. So of course, in a way, everyone's looking forward to that. But in a way, also you have become more conscious about the way how we meet with friends in bars and restaurants. Because typically, you know, we wouldn't have thought twice about what to do on a Friday night or a Saturday night. It would just be basically, which bar do we go to? But over the past weeks, I think we've also become a bit more creative on how we can actually spend time with each other. And I think there will be a huge renaissance of picnics this summer, because I don't know if people actually want to sit with masks in restaurants, probably not. So we will have to use the spaces outside much more. And if I was a restaurant holder, I would immediately set up picnic packages and just, you know, distribute them to wherever people are sitting outside. Or actually, another thing that I did in the past weeks is I actually went on discovery tours in the districts of Vienna. And we have 23 districts, you know, so you can meet up with a friend or actually even have a date, as I did. And just say, you know, this time we're just going to this district and we're not going to leave the district for the time being. And we just search for things that we didn't know before, that we like, that we somehow consider beautiful. And it's a great way of reconnecting with your city and rediscovering your own city. I love that. I will definitely continue doing that.
What is your wish for your fellow Austrian citizens that are now flocking onto these restaurants on Friday?
I think I would probably have the same wish for my fellow Austrians as for anyone else. I started a little thing on Facebook when the lockdown started, that every Sunday I asked on my wall, I did a little post and asked my friends for things that they have experienced over the past weeks that were beautiful to them. And I called it Collateral Beauty. And I love the concept of it, because it basically just says that in everything, in every chaos or in every tragedy, in every crisis that happens, there is also this hidden beauty. So I think what I would wish for everyone is just to be aware of that beauty and not just forget it immediately. Because people were, writing beautiful posts about how they could reconnect with their families and how they could spend more time with themselves and with music. And lots of them got really creative. And I think it's important to remember that joyful element of the lockdown as well, and those positive elements, and just not forget it, and just stick with it and take whatever emerged for each of us individually, just take it with us into this this new normal, as you call it.
And sort of like moving from the individual level all the way up to the socio-political level. What is your wish for the world?
I think one of the things that struck me the most early on, and that's still kind of keeping me amazed, is the mere fact that this crisis has shown us that the world that we're living in is not as fixed as we always thought. And that to me is mind-blowing, just being aware that things that we would have never thought possible 2 months ago happened. And of course, a lot of negative things happened. But if you look at this, it also goes the other way. And it also means that there are so many possibilities for invention, for creativity, and for hope that we maybe wouldn't have thought possible 2 months ago, but are suddenly possible. And that's beautiful.
And as a business owner, what do you have up your sleeves? What are you currently inventing that people can experience soon?
Well, I will hopefully continue to create meaningful gatherings. Might it be offline or might it be online for the time being? And I'm very happy if anyone's interested in that for them to just get in contact with me. I think in general, this whole phase has very much deepened my connection to my purpose, which is really just to bring people together and make us more aware of this feeling of togetherness. And that can happen in very different settings and events. So if anyone's interested in that, or if anyone has any inputs on that, I'd be really curious to hear how people create those feelings of togetherness in their specific circles.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for your insights. I really, really enjoyed that. And see you next time, whether that's on another surface called Zoom or in the real world. We'll see.
Thank you so much, Marcus, for having me. And I'm very curious to continue listening to the other people that you'll invite on this podcast and learn more about how to not go back to normal.
Thanks for listening. I do hope you enjoyed this conversation. You can find some useful links in the podcast notes. I have lined up some amazing guests for the next few episodes, and I would love your feedback, thoughts, and suggestions so that I can evolve this experiment based on what's needed in the business world right now. I want to make capitalism much more conscious, and for that we need businesses to have more purpose, more people to show more leadership, and organizations to have more positive impact on stakeholders, including our blue planet, the only known habitable place in the universe. You can email me on hello@marcusdruen.com or search for Marcus Druen on LinkedIn. Please do subscribe to my podcast and share this with other people. Catch you soon. Not back to normal.